Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the Director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance here at the Munk School of Global Affairs. On behalf of the Chair of our board, Alan Broadbent, who's here, and our board members and staff, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's session on Over Budget and Behind Schedule, the Causes and Cures of Infrastructure Cost Overruns. We're hosting this event today at the same time as we are launching a paper that Matti Siemiatycki has written for IMFG on cost overruns on infrastructure projects, and you will have been able to pick up a copy outside. If not, it's also available on our website if you want to download it from there. We knew when we asked Matti to write a paper about cost overruns that it would be topical, but I don't think we knew just how topical it was going to be. Since Matti started his paper, we've been reading in the papers about cost overruns on all kinds of projects, and most recently, $400 million cost overrun on the York-Spadina subway line. So we know we have a problem. We've also just come through a federal election where the new government has promised to invest in a major way in infrastructure projects across the country. So we also know we have to do better. So I think this is going to be a very interesting and enlightening session this afternoon. Before I introduce our moderator, I would like to thank the sponsors of the Institute, Havana Capital, the Province of Ontario, TD Bank Group, and the City of Toronto. I would also like to thank our terrific team at IMFG, Selena Zhang and Carolyn Carteropoulos, for making this event happen and making it happen in such great style. Lastly, I'm supposed to tell you that if you are tweeting about this event, our hashtag, which is up here, is IMFG Talks. To moderate the discussion today, I would like to introduce Andy Manahan. Andy is the Executive Director of the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario, RCCAO. Andy knows a lot about infrastructure in general, and he also knows about cost overruns. RCCAO has commissioned over 30 research reports in the area of infrastructure, on infrastructure funding deficits, on ways to increase investment in water and sewers, bridges, roads, and transit, and on improving government procurement practices. So as I said, he knows a lot about this subject. Please welcome Andy Manahan.
Thank you very much, Enid. It's a pleasure to be here, and also thank you to Alan for your constant support. We're actually coming up to 37 reports. Matti Siemiatycki is actually working on a report for RCCO right now on the federal role in infrastructure, and very specifically looking at the announcement that the Liberal government recently made about coming forward with an infrastructure bank. So we like to keep the dialogue going, just like IMFG does. It's been a very busy week, as Enid had suggested. On Monday, we saw the FCM, CCA, and some other groups release the report card on infrastructure, and that clearly showed that we have an infrastructure deficit. So with that in mind, there will be a lot of construction projects, and we need to get it right in terms of trying to limit cost overruns. And I think that's important because if we're able to be more cost effective in our projects, there will be more money for other infrastructure projects as well as other services that the government provides. The paper that Matti has put forward, I think, is excellent. It's thoughtful, thought-provoking. It doesn't point to there being one enemy. As you'll hear from him in a moment, there's 5 cures, and I don't want to get into them. But just in terms of one respect, there is some talk about big data. And of course, big data and modeling is not everything. You have to look at engineering and operational considerations. Construction projects are, by their very nature, very complex. But there is a very important role for big data and how things are done, and that's some of the other research that RCCA has done. Enid had mentioned the 2 reports that we've done. The one in 2010, I think, is particularly relevant to the work that Matti's looking at. And I'm sure we're going to get into this topic with our 2 speakers as well, the 2 panelists. But the main takeaway from the 2010 report was that there seems to be a tendency to bulletproof projects. So all the risk is transferred onto the private sector, or as much as the public sector can transfer. And of course, then there's going to be a risk premium for those projects, so it'll cost more. It's not exactly related to cost overruns, but there's all sorts of linkages in construction, as we're going to hear. The other thing I wanted to point out, and it doesn't get mentioned too often, and it's primarily something that our industry members face day to day, but when projects start, you have to call one call, it's called, to get a utility locate. There's Giovanni from the Sewer and Water, and that's a very big issue for his group. And we're finding on almost every project now that there are delays in getting the locates. The mandated time frame is 5 days, and in many cases, they're weeks, if not months. And that right off the bat results in very high cost in terms of rescheduling crews and all the rest of it, getting permits and getting locates done all over again. Wanted to mention one other thing. Michael Fenn is here, and he's done a couple of very good reports for RCCO, but one last September was a signature document for us, which looked at the future of infrastructure. And basically, it's how do we be, more forward-looking or forward-thinking about the kinds of infrastructure that we deliver? And there's a couple of good quotes in the paper, and I don't mean to denigrate the major theme of this event, but Michael has said that today's infrastructure seems expensive, but yesterday's seems like a prudent investment. And the example that he gave was the Bloor Viaduct, which about 100 years ago cost a little bit more, but it saved us so much time because they were building that for a future streetcar. It turned out in the 60s they put a subway across the Don Valley. But that's the kind of forward thinking and planning that I think we need to do. And we're going to hear more about that from Matti, which is a very exciting paper. I'm not sure if I was supposed to introduce the other speakers right now, Enid. Okay, so I'll introduce or provide the short bio for Matti, and then I'll mention the backgrounds for the two panelists. I'm not going to read all the stuff because it's going to take too long, and probably most of you in this room know the basic background anyways. But Matti is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at U of T. His teaching and research focus on infrastructure planning, financing, and project delivery. His recent studies explore the merits of delivering infrastructure mega projects through public-private partnerships, especially as they relate to value for money risk transfer and the meeting of public policy goals. His research draws on experience from across Canada and around the world to provide insights into the global state of practice with mega project management. Ehren Cory, I think, has been with Infrastructure Ontario for 2 years. I've dealt with him on some of the committee work that we've been doing in terms of AFP and bundling and foreign investment. And I knew right away that you were going to rise to a good, he's the currently the divisional president for project delivery. So congratulations on that. I know that just happened last fall. And last but not least, James Purkis, and he had a very good spread, I think, in one of the major newspapers last year. He said great international experience, and I think we can learn a lot as well during the panel discussion from James. His major project right now is the Regional Express Rail for Metrolinx, and he's the Executive VP doing that. So without any further ado, may I introduce Matti.
Thanks, Andy, for the introduction, and it's great to be here to speak with you about this really timely topic. Just to start off, I want to thank Enid and IMFG for the opportunity to write the paper and now to present in front of this audience, and Selena Zhang for organizing so effectively. This issue of cost overruns and infrastructure more broadly has really clearly risen to the top of the agenda. It's not often that infrastructure dominates a federal election, but it seemed to have been one of the top issues in the fall, and now has carried through. And if you open any newspaper across this country, infrastructure is a topic that is a key theme that we see time and again in the stories. And I think part of this is the country is about to embark on the biggest infrastructure building boom in a generation. it's fair to say we skipped a generation of infrastructure building. Most of what we currently have was built in the 60s, and we're now, a lot of it is aging. It's clear that our economy, our environment, our social inclusion and equity depend on high quality infrastructure. So we're clearly at a point now where there's a broad recognition that we need to get on with it and start building infrastructure. The language that's being used in the political sphere and in the op-eds and in a lot of the commentary on infrastructure is really about doing this right. And in the last few days, if you read the stories in the Globe and Mail, they're really talking about picking the right projects, that there's a lot of concern that when we talk about shovel ready, we're going to rush things and we're going to pick projects that may have short-term benefits or may be politically motivated, but are not necessarily going to deliver the long-term goals. So there's really been a key focus on doing it right and picking the right projects. And I guess the other side of doing it right is once you pick the right projects to actually deliver them effectively, to actually procure them well, get them built on time and on budget, and started and built as expected and as we say we're going to do. And so that's what I really want to focus on. In terms of this building boom, just to give you a sense of the scope, the federal government has recently announced they're going to double their infrastructure spending over the next 10 years to $124 billion. The province has a 10-year, $130 billion infrastructure plan. The city's 10-year plan alone is $31 billion. And if you look at municipalities across the province and across the country, they have equally large for their size infrastructure plans. So there's a huge amount of money out there. And if we start having major overruns or delays, there's a lot at stake here in terms of if we don't get this right, both on picking the right projects, but for today's focus, actually once we pick them, having them built on time and on budget. So that's what I want to focus on today. Now, when we think about infrastructure and when we think about cost overruns, we seem to come at this through media representations of the issue. And again, you can open most newspapers, at least a couple, you can open most newspapers fairly frequently and see stories about cost overruns. I could spend a large portion of my talk just listing all the cost overruns that have occurred here in Toronto over the last number of years. But when you look more broadly, what you tend to find is that cost overruns and delay are one of the few issues that unites this country. Like, right across the country, from coast to coast, you can see stories about cost overruns. And I mean that quite literally. From British Columbia having problems with implementation to a major dam in Newfoundland that's currently under construction is now having major cost overruns. You see this right across the country. And the other thing to keep in mind is this is both a national issue, it's also a public and a private sector issue. This is not just governments who can't deliver projects in the private sector who has a great level of effectiveness. We've seen in the energy sector that energy projects in the oil sands, they've had challenges, and also companies like Bombardier have had major problems delivering their own infrastructure projects. So this is not, there's something much bigger going on than just a challenge of how government delivers projects. This is something that's endemic and inherent in big-scale infrastructure projects. Just here in Toronto, to list a few of them, Spadina Subway, we've now heard that that's likely to be $400 million over budget. Nathan Phillips Square, Brampton City Hall, the streetcar barns at Leslie Street, and now Queens Quay also had a major cost overrun. So this is just a short list, but puts into context locally, we also have a common, this same problem is an issue here. Now, oftentimes we like to think Toronto is unique, and maybe this is just our problem, or maybe Canada is unique. This is a global epidemic. This is something that's happening truly at a global scale. And again, if you visited any of these countries, or you visited different places around the world, you see these same stories repeating over and over again. Countries that are known for having effective procurement, like the United Kingdom, they tend to be held up as the project management leaders. And then there you see at the bottom, Edinburgh Trams. That was just in the last few years. That had a major cost overrun. Other countries that don't have such an illustrious history with project delivery, countries like India, where 5 and 10-year delays on projects, multi-million, billion-dollar cost overruns are common, they also share this challenge. So this really is something that's at a global scale. Now, as I mentioned, we tend to come at this through a media representation, and we tend to see these as, the media tends to report on these as one-off cases. So when they report these, it's as if it's big news for that day, that this project or that project is over budget. And they tend not to string together a wider narrative of how commonplace this actually is across the broad swath of projects in all sectors that we're delivering. So that's the other piece of this. This is about transportation, but it's also about energy, housing, sports and recreation events, all sorts of big projects. Once projects get into the big scale, they start to have these problems about overruns and delays. Now, before we go any further, I think it's relevant to ask the question, well, why is this actually important? Maybe this is just a feature of how we deliver big projects, and we can live with it. This is the cost of doing big things. If you want to dream big, you have to accept that in certain instances you're going to have cost overruns. And I would argue that there's these three reasons why we need to be aware of this and try to get on top of this as an issue. The first is it's a waste of money. Plain and simple, this is a waste of money that could be going elsewhere. We have, even though we're pledging big dollars, we also have limited resources. And if more money than is expected is going into one project, we necessarily will not have money to put into other very important and meaningful projects, worthy projects. So we have to understand this first as a potential waste of money. The second issue is that it's embarrassing, and the costs of that embarrassment are starting to escalate quite significantly. So you start to see quotes like, John Tory coming out as the Spadina subway goes over budget, saying he's furious at this project going over budget. You're even starting to see project managers paying the price with their jobs in some instances for projects going over budget. So there are political costs to cost overruns at the election booth, but there's also costs for the people who are working on these projects. So this really is a potential for embarrassment and repercussions for those who are involved in these projects. I guess the final point, and this is the one that most concerns me, is that at a time where we're talking about the importance of infrastructure, we've built the case and convinced the politicians and the public of how important this is, we really can lose their trust. And we can lose their trust that we're able, as project managers, to actually deliver these projects effectively. And if we lose that trust, then the next time we go back and say, now we need to build infrastructure again, there's going to be a sense that the support may not be there as they start to say these projects are racking up these major cost overruns. The competence isn't there to deliver these projects. And so we may lose the initiative to actually be able to keep building all of this critically important infrastructure. So we have to understand that the costs of overruns are both financial, but also very much in terms of the public appetite for delivering, for accepting and delivering these projects. And also, they really tie up resources and they can make living in cities much more inconvenient. So we do really need to get on top of this as an issue in terms of how we deliver these big projects. So, as I mentioned, we have tended historically to see these as one-off cases. This was, this event, the event happened on this big infrastructure project, and that's why this project went over budget. This one was highly political, so that's why that project went over budget. My colleague, Bent Fluberg at Oxford University, he's done the groundbreaking studies with large samples of data to try to pull together a bigger picture of what's happening globally. And what the evidence seems to show is this is not a unique phenomenon. This is not a one-off. This is something that's much more systematic when we're talking about these big-scale projects. So the evidence, this is from the transportation sector. This was his first sort of large-scale study. This looked at 258 projects worldwide, so a pretty big sample, projects over $100 million, and he finds that it's almost every time. It's 9 out of 10 times these big projects, big roads or bridges or tunnels or transit projects are going over budget. The average size of the overrun is 28%. So that's pretty significant if you're building a $1 billion project. It's $280 million. That's pretty significant. And for some of the projects we're now contemplating, the scale of these projects is even bigger than $1 billion. If that was just the average, if you just hit the average cost overrun, then you're already looking at a pretty significant amount. Perhaps more troubling for where we are and what we're currently investing in Canada, transit is a high priority sector, and for good reason. Transit projects have the potential to deliver great benefits. They also have the highest cost overruns in his sample. So we do need to be aware, the average cost overrun on a transit project in Professor Fluberg's study is 45%. That's a staggering amount of cost escalation, and that really would draw money away from other places. Roads have slightly smaller cost overruns, but the key point of this as well is not just the size of the overrun, but the fact that this is generally unchanged over the last 70 years in his sample. So it's not like we're getting better at this. You would expect that as we become more scientific, as we learn how to do this, as we practice, and remember, these projects are being done by professional project managers. They're not done by rookies who this is their first try, first kick at the can. These are done by professionals who've done them over and over again. You would think the science would be getting better, but it hasn't. We're at the same point. Just to put this in perspective, it's not just transportation projects. Big IT projects, both projects done by the public sector and the private sector, are prone to major cost overruns. This graphic on your left is quite an interesting graphic. It picks out and shows some of the projects that have had the biggest cost overruns. And the most interesting point is the big circle is actually a Canadian IT project. It was the Long Gun Registry, which had a catastrophic escalation in cost to the point where it actually ended up getting canceled. So all of the other overruns on all the other projects can fit within that one in terms of its scale and magnitude. But many of these other projects are in the energy sector. Nuclear projects have a history of going way over a budget, and so do dams, so that's in the energy sector. But IT projects, too, are really prone to all of the features that I'll talk about why project costs so consistently escalate. So the other piece of this is that projects escalate at different phases in their delivery. And it's worth keeping in mind that the way that academics have tended to identify an overrun is not necessarily just from the point of the contract being signed. That is only one stage in the project delivery. The academics tend to look at from the point of project approval as being the key decision point where the cost should be fixed. And after that, they tend to focus on how projects escalate. And so what you can see in this graphic is that the costs tend to escalate. When you look at the actual phasing, the costs tend to escalate over time at key phases. So it's that first phase when they get approved, then you tend to see costs starting to escalate to the point where you get to the final drawings. And then from the final drawings, there's another point of escalation after the bidding comes in. And then a project, once the contract is signed and it's actually being built, then there might be another phase of cost overrun. But this is important because what it implies is that it's not just the actual part where the shovels are in the ground where costs escalate. They escalate at all different stages of these projects. And we have to really be aware of that and focus not only on that last stage where it's very public, but also all the lead up to those cost overruns. Now, part of the other feature of this, there is a politics to reporting on cost overruns and what actually constitutes a cost overrun. And there's some interesting cases here. So the one, again, on your left is the Laval Metro extension. When this project was announced in 2000, it was announced at $179 million. Okay? It then escalated, and by 2007, the project, when the project was completed, you may not be able to read the writing on the press release. This is the official press release from the project managers, which says announcing the new extension, and then underneath there it says mission accomplished. And it writes on time and on budget at $804 million. Okay? And they're out there promoting this as on time and on budget. So the point here is that there's an important role for us as the public and our media to be tracking this. And when someone says something like on time and on budget at $804 million, when the project was announced at $179 million, to really hold people accountable, that you can make a project on time and on budget, but the question is which timeline and which budget are you actually talking about? And the graphic on your right shows that the budgets change quite significantly. So these are budgets for infrastructure projects delivered in British Columbia, all of which have been announced as on time and on budget. But again, I ask you the question, which timeline, which budget? These were the budgets at the times that the projects were approved. The budget on the right is then the budget at the time that the contract was signed. And as you can see, in each of these cases, there was a pretty significant escalation in that cost. Once the contract was actually signed, then they did deliver it on time and on budget. But the question I would ask again is that on time and on budget, or is it really the budget when the project was approved that we should really be concerned about? Because that's what the politicians were understanding and voting on, and that's what the public accepted by extension when those projects were approved. So my point in this is we really do need to be aware of this notion of which budgets we're actually focusing on, because there can be ways of highlighting different aspects and politics to the way that we do the budgeting and the announcements of those budgets. So when we focus on why does this happen, what are the causes of this? I mean, I think I've demonstrated clearly that this is an epidemic, that this is happening globally and it's happening on a whole variety of different projects. But we can ask the question now, well, why? And the answer to that question in many ways depends on how cynical you want to be. Anyone who has renovated their home knows that there are technical challenges and things that come up when you're doing a project, and that's for a small project. Scale that up to a multi-billion-dollar project with many different stakeholders involved and many different contractors involved, and you start to understand, at the very least, the types of technical problems that arise. To highlight a few, we see that there's unexpected events that happen on everything. We might start digging or open up a wall and find that there's something behind that wall. The way that contractors interact with each other and handover risk can create problems. Utilities is a huge issue when we're building projects in urban environments. That's been a key place where projects have gone over budget in terms of utilities. Archaeology and archaeological finds or history and historical preservation, that's another place where we've seen major cost overruns. So, and inflation in materials and labor. All of these are places where, and scope changes, that's the last one I want to highlight. There are major scope changes that often happen in these projects. And so in fact, an overrun, if you talk to the project manager, they'll say, that wasn't an overrun at all. The actual scale of the project increased. Someone at the last minute threw in 2 more stations on this subway line and then expected us to build it at the same cost. That's actually a scope change, perhaps not an overrun. And so we have to be quite precise about it. But the key piece is that if this was just a technical problem, you would expect us to get better over time. And for the most part, that hasn't happened. The evidence just doesn't support that. So now we have to start looking into the more cynical aspects of why this might be going on. And here we can look at 2 areas. One is that really what Fluber calls that we're project management fools. That basically that humans are overly optimistic and that we fool ourselves into believing that we have more control over our surrounding environment than we think. And this draws on the Nobel Prize-winning economics of Daniel Kahneman, who talked about behavioral economics and talked a lot about how humans see the world and are repeatedly optimistic about their abilities to deliver things and the likelihood that all the positive factors that are going to have to come together in order to deliver a project are going to come together just as expected. And what we find is that tends not to happen in practice. Daniel Kahneman's line is, most people are highly optimistic most of the time. And when you think about that in terms of forecasting and predicting futures, if you're optimistic on just a few of your variables, it will ricochet over time into high optimism biases in your evaluations, and you're likely to end up with down the road issues that arise. So again, that's if you want to think of us as project management fools. The other side he talks about is if we're project management liars, and this is where we really get into the cynical dark art of how infrastructure projects get planned, the politics and the organizational tensions of how we actually plan and deliver big projects. So big projects, there is a lot at stake here. If you build one project, a certain group of stakeholders and interest groups will benefit. If you build another project, a very different group may benefit, both geographically and in terms of the political interests and the financial interests that are involved. And so what we tend to find then is that there's a big incentive to get your projects built. And there's an argument that if you actually announced how much the project was going to cost before you started, it would never get approved. So there is a high level of incentive for different stakeholders to be underestimating their costs to get it approved, to make it look better than the projects they're competing against. We know there's scarce resources. We know there's a lot of projects to go around. There's a lot of projects that want money. So maybe making your project look better up front is important. And once that project is funded and shovels are in the ground, they very rarely get canceled. And as the budgets escalate, you're already on the hook, and they tend to pour more money into them. So this is the sort of this is what Fluberg calls strategic misrepresentation. Right? That these costs are being strategically misrepresented up front in order to get approval for these projects. So I did a study that looked at, well, how do we actually weigh the difference of these variables? I mean, which ones do you put priority on? And what you see is that when auditors and auditor generals tend to look at these projects, what they find is that they put the emphasis on the technical problems. They tend to look at scope changes, poor project planning. One of the more shocking aspects of big project management is how many of these major projects start without a completed plan. It's shocking that you would start building $1 billion project without finished drawings, or without all the funding arranged, or without all the approvals or the EA assessments. So that's another piece of this that often gets highlighted. Also, poor evidence and monitoring. We rarely track how these projects are actually being rolled out in their details, and try to use that information to make better informed decisions in the future. So that's another area. And then some of the studies do also highlight the darker art of strategic misrepresentation. And as a factor for why projects go over budget. So there's all this range of both technical optimism bias and then these political economic factors for why projects tend to escalate. So what can be done about this? And there have been many attempts to try to come up with strategies in the past. I'm going to highlight 5 in just a minute, but I do want to just put out there that I haven't invented this or reinvented the wheel, and many of our organizations globally, and some of them here in Ontario, are using various pieces of these strategies. So there are approaches for doing better forecasting, and there also are ways of doing better contracting to try to shift the incentives. And what I want to highlight in the 5 strategies that I'm going to put forward now is that really, if you want to get at managing cost overruns and addressing this issue, clamping down on them, you have to understand and you have to address both the technical and the institutional and political economic factors that lead to them. You have to address them not just as a technical problem, but as something that is institutional and organizational, and is in many ways even about human nature. You have to get right behind those factors and really shift the incentives, so that the incentive shifts from a model where you're encouraged to underestimate the cost in order to get your project started and then have it run up after it starts, and shift the incentive to saying, now there is good reason to deliver this project on time and on budget, because it will benefit you as the project procurer and as the proponent of that project. So now let me set out 5 ideas, 5 strategies that can be used ideally in concert. I think these fit together, and these 5 strategies that can be used to clamp down on cost overruns. The first one is we need to get smart about this. We need to be using data and a greater understanding of information, and using information in big data and the computational power that is now available to be better understanding what's going on. As I mentioned, it is really if you think about the sports business is essentially a data business now, and but yet there's more information being used to model and pick which professional athlete should be chosen for a team, which left fielder the Blue Jays should pick, then is being used to design and select and manage these very large infrastructure projects. We need to get a lot smarter about how we're doing this. We need to be collecting data on estimated and actual costs. We need to be understanding how the performance penalties are being used across multiple organizations, not just internal to one organization. We need to really be studying change orders. We need to look at performance variation by firm. This is controversial, of course, because it might turn out that some firms are better than others. We need to be benchmarking their performance. This might be even more controversial. We need to be benchmarking the performance of our public sector managers, because internally, some may be better than others. And we can study that and learn that and train those folks who are not performing quite as well to up their game. But the information is really what is important here. That's what allows us to do better. And with some of the modeling techniques that are out there, we can become much more predictive. Let's come up with strategies that highlight, that tell us, as these projects are going on, not after they're built, as they're going on, what are the red flags that we should be looking for? predictive about what issues cause cost overruns if we have a big enough sample. And I think we need to start collecting that data and being much more systematic across organizations. The federal government has suggested that they're going to get into the information and data collection business around infrastructure. They recognize that this is a space that could be very deliver a lot of benefit. And I think that could be a major contribution. But the second piece is that data on its own is not going to solve this, because we can collect all the data we want. If it's not used to actually make better decisions, it will just sit there on the shelf and cost us a fortune. So the next part of this is we need to integrate that data in a systematic way into our procurement models. And so one of the things that's been done elsewhere, one of the things we've seen elsewhere in countries like Singapore is they have now started to collect all of this data and use it to inform their next decisions. So what they'll do is, whereas we tend to use, not always, but we tend to use a lowest cost type of procurement model, what they do is they've collected all this data. If you could read this, you would see the top firms in a certain sector, all publicly available on their website. This took me 5 minutes to figure out who the best firms are in Singapore to do a job. And then they benchmark them, and they say, if you score over a minimum score on our ranking system, then when you bid for the next job, you'll get additional points on your bid. You'll have a better chance of winning. And so what we're doing is we're flipping the incentive from every firm coming in low and then seeing their prices escalate to now saying you have an incentive to do this properly. Both build the job properly, and they go out and test for quality, but also build it on time and on budget, because you will have a much better chance of getting the next job. And what you see, the graphic on the top, what that one shows is that the performance in their industry, more firms are getting those higher rankings because they have this very transparent system. And I think this could really pay dividend if we did this not just at a local level. This has to be done, you have to be looking at projects across a much broader scale at a provincial or even at the federal level. And so I think there is a real opportunity both to collect more data and then come up with ways to integrate it into our projects procurement and selection, firm selection or bid selection processes. Third, I want to talk about is really upping the game of our staffs, becoming of the government agencies, becoming better, more informed, effective buyers of services. And the UK has led the way in this. They actually created a major project leadership academy where managers of projects over a certain scale have to go through this academy. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Why would you have people who are delivering mega projects that are going to cost billions of dollars, and if they go wrong, are going to cause huge impacts on your budgets, and have them not be fully trained? And so they've developed this leadership academy to try to raise the stakes and raise the training of the people who are managing these projects. And I think here in Canada, we now, as we're moving into a period, I listed over $260 billion of infrastructure just between the federal government and the provincial government, that there is an incentive really to try to get much smarter and train our staff much better so that they have the project management skills, the contract management skills, and the dispute resolution skills for these big projects. Fourth is to improve forecasting methods, and once you have better data, you can improve forecasting and project evaluation methods. So reference class forecasting is a model that Professor Fluberg has developed, where basically he argues you should take an outside view of your project. So once you understand what the budget is, you should look to similar projects around the world that have had, and try to understand what their cost overruns have been on those projects. So you're not just looking internally at your own books, you're also trying to benchmark against international experience. And he finds that that's been quite a successful approach. The other one that I've put up as a graphic is something that's done in Norway. And what they do is they have a peer review system. And it seems so simple. Get a second pair of eyes on something. And what they do is they've made it very formal that once the cost estimate is done, they then put it out to a first quality assessment, QA1. That's when the cabinet decision is made. They then have a second formal decision once it gets parliamentary approval. And at each of those stages, they have an outside view, someone who wasn't involved in the project, look at that cost estimate and tell them if they think it's reasonable. And what the research is showing on this model is that this is actually leading to much better, more accurate estimates. And the important part is because it's being done before the final approval, If there's problems with the bid and the cost needs to be raised, at least the politicians know before they're approving it. It doesn't come afterwards when there's nothing you can do about it and the costs just start to spiral. So I think this could also be something that it could be effectively integrated into our procurement approaches. But it's really about, this suggestion is about improving our forecasting methods and becoming more systematic in how we do it. I guess the other piece of this is you should actually do a cost estimate. I mean, as simple as that sounds, how many of our projects proceed with no cost estimate? Just today, we heard an announcement that the Scarborough subway extension is going to save, if they do it this way, if they do it with no stops, one stop instead of 3 stops, it's going to save $1 billion. Has there been a real cost estimate done on that? It's hard to tell. So you actually have to do cost estimates. And perhaps that's another piece of this, that in many cases here, we tend to rush to pick projects before we've done enough of the preliminary assessments. And the final strategy that can be used is public-private partnerships. And this is, as Andy mentioned, this is an approach that essentially what you're trying to do is transfer risk to the private sector. And what you're doing is essentially buying an insurance policy against cost overruns. So this is not this is not a free strategy. This has significant upfront costs associated with it. You do pay a premium upfront, but given how large the cost overruns are, you may be able to derive benefit from that. And so the experience here in Ontario and also in British Columbia is that the projects that are delivered through public-private partnerships have tended to be, by all accounts, delivered on time and on budget for the most part. Now, the question I would ask is, what timeline and what budget? Because what the UK experience is showing is that there is a significant premium that's being paid. And the broader question is, could those projects be managed using all of the other strategies that I've identified in order to clamp down on some of those overruns and yet do it at a lower cost? In some ways, how you answer this question really depends on which stakeholder you are. Politicians are terrified of cost overruns. These are so public, and I showed you all the media coverage of them. So for many politicians nowadays, they would rather pay a very significant premium. Can the public tell the difference between 1.2 billion and 1.4 billion? I'm not so sure, but that's $200 million in difference. So, but politicians, what we find is that they're very willing to pay a premium up front to avoid a cost overrun down the road that's going to become quite significant. We still need much more evidence on how significant the premiums actually are in practice here in Canada, and whether some of those project costs could be managed better once you have the effective project management staff in place, once you have better data collection, once you're integrating that procurement information into your decision making. Could we actually clamp down on some of that and use the project finance, use private finance and public-private partnerships really only when they're best applicable, and in other cases use a much broader project management approach. We're seeing some of that now, and I think we should really reflect on in what context is our public-private partnerships really the best approach to use. So to conclude, it's clear that cost overruns are a major project here in Canada, just like they are internationally. In that case, we're not unique. I've identified some strategies that I think will work and have been demonstrated globally to work in terms of clamping down on cost overruns. The final point I want to return to is this notion of picking the right projects, that there is a sense that we can become fixated on cost overruns as one of the drivers of a good project. But we also really do have to keep in mind there's such thing as successful failures and failed successes. You could deliver a project on time and on budget, but if you've picked the wrong project, that will deliver very little benefit. It'll be great success, you'll be written up as having done a great job on procurement, and it turns out it's the wrong project. There's also the successful failure. So you could have a project that has major cost overruns and is derided in the press while it's being built, and then has high level of success once it's open. So and delivers real social or economic and environmental benefits. The key is to marry both of those. It's to get this project selection done right, and then to marry that with effective procurement that uses the right procurement model and integrates professional data collection and project management skills all the way through to construction completion and through operation and maintenance. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Is for both of our panelists just to provide their overall impressions of the comments that Matti made. Are there areas of agreement, disagreement, and then we'll get board down into more specifics. James?
Yeah, okay. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Matti's cost overrun on infrastructure paper, it presents a good concise summary on the subject. I've managed many major programs around the world, in Europe, in Asia for the last 20 years. And the general themes and trends that I see from the paper are consistent to everywhere I've worked. There's not a single solution or a simple solution to major programs. Generally, the ones that don't go too well are very complex, and they've always got unique constraints and challenges. In terms of how to sort of move forwards and some of the observations from the findings there is a key challenge, and what I see on a lot of the projects that go the wrong way, it's really establishing the project governance and not political governance at the start of the program, so that the right people are engaged and the program's launched with all the right details and information from day one. That decisions are based on facts. And so in terms of major projects, they take several years to shape and deliver. The project requires investment over a number of stages: business case, design, build, operate. And these are quite different skill sets. And by observation, often it's the same team runs the project all the way through, or it's passed from team to team. As we run through those stages, at the business case, the managers are responsible for examining options and assembling a case for the project. They tend to focus on the financials, and they're motivated by achieving approval for their projects. And so they're prone to optimism bias, missing the practical issues of project delivery and operation. The project managers are responsible for designing and building the facilities in accordance with the design, with their business case. They tend to focus on delivery, perhaps providing themselves with some pride. They always deliver on time, but they have to cope with the reality, and often they find the budget and the plan that was set in the business case needs to be updated on a regular basis. The operation managers, as these facilities are completed, they are interested in how well it works in practice. What they're given is rarely what they asked for at the beginning or what they asked to be built, and they then have a contrary understanding as to the way the designer intended the facility to be used and initiate local changes to align it with their thinking. And in terms of those sort of three summaries of the activities on the stages, it's so important to ensure at the beginning that all these people are brought together and have their input into what the project is before it starts. At that, I'll pass over and questions later.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Ehren, Cory from Infrastructure Ontario. Many of you in the room would know IO. Matti talked about the P3 model. Infrastructure Ontario was created about a decade ago to be the center of excellence for large project delivery at the provincial level. So we work with James on transit projects or a local hospital board in delivering a hospital on the large complex projects. And we tend to use what we call the AFP model, of a form of P3 to do so. So I'm looking forward to number 5 on Matti's list, which I'll talk about. Maybe what I thought I would do is just run through the cures. I think what Matti has laid out is a really interesting framework, both thinking about the causes, but the cures that you outlined. So what I thought I would just spend a minute and talk about the 5 and where I think we are in Ontario, since that's where I live and what I see each day. The first one on your list, which is the use of data. I think this is a huge challenge here as everywhere. And I think the whole industry could get better. I think the challenges are all the ones you outlined, Matti. It's the challenge to transparency, because people face reputational risk, there's confidentiality, there's a whole bunch of issues that make sharing, especially across entities, really hard, but we have to overcome them. But I think the biggest problem is actually one you pointed at in your talk, but it's the lack of standard language or taxonomy. The number of times we try and talk to other agencies or entities, either here in Ontario or abroad, about performance, and they say, well, we were on time and on budget, and we say, we were too. Whether we are using the same definition of either is very unclear. And I think that so that's a challenge at the macro in terms of tracking performance, but I think what's even worse is what you'd love to be able to do with data is not just talk about project performance, but root causes. What you'd love to be able to do is understand the analysis you showed that you did in 2010 that was looking at what were when audits were done, what were given as the reasons, because that's what you can actually then figure out what to address. There we have no commonality as governments, as agencies, as entities of how we track or talk about those things. So until you could create some consistency, that'll make data really challenging, but I think it's a place that's very ripe here in Ontario as it is elsewhere. A place where data is serving us, I think, much better now than it has in the past is around setting accurate project budgets. And I'll come back and talk about that because your forecasting point is, I think, relevant. But one place where I think we've gotten a lot better by having a sort of a central repository is when we develop budgets, because we have past data that we can then use. Now, you talked about the use of past performance. Your second cure was about the use of past performance of vendors. I think there, I would say two things. You showed a chart from somewhere where they have the scorecards. One thing, this is something we're obsessed with at Infrastructure Ontario. Part of why we were created was because we manage a pipeline of these projects. We actually have a tool that looks just like the one you had on your screen that we use for our smaller capital projects. So when the province is doing a renovation in one of the province's 5,000 structures that it owns across the province, we have a database like that. We have objective criteria where we score a vendor's performance. Were they timely? Did they do high quality work? Were they clean on the job site? Were they safe? We score those and we use that data in the next procurement. And it's weighted as part of the score. So we do that. And it's something we're really proud of. I think where we don't do it yet, and your push is valid, is as you get into the larger scale projects. And it's harder. It's harder for a lot of reasons. Those projects take 5 and 6 years to see through completion, so you don't have the same quick feedback loop. They're done in consortia, and teams change on each bid, so how much do I ascribe to a given team member is not so straightforward. Those aren't reasons not to do it. And we've been working, and it's something we talk about with our partners like a Metrolinx on the idea of vendor scorecards or report cards, and how do we incorporate that lesson. So as I say, we do it on small projects below the $10 million threshold. Smaller stuff we do. Larger projects, I think, is a place we absolutely need to go. I couldn't agree with you more. And it's something, as a public procurement agent, and many in the room, I have public sector colleagues here, one of the things we often feel constrained by is, well, we have to score based on the grid we have and the criteria we have, and we know that just down the road, we're working on a project with the same contractor and having problems. And it's a pretty horrible feeling to feel constrained from using obvious data. So, as I say, it's something we're obsessed with and trying to bring to our larger projects. You talked about having skills and the training. I have a bias here since we were created in some way to provide some of that center of excellence, but I think you're absolutely right, and the biggest challenge we face is just sort of long-term thinking enough to make that investment in our people. Just briefly, I want to get to our questions, but you talked about forecasting, and I think a couple of things here, and I have some of my colleagues here who could speak to this better than I, but we've got an amazing, maybe it's lucky, because when I see your presentation, there's something we've done in Ontario that I would just highlight. The way our process works, you showed the chart from original, when the project decision is made versus when the contract is awarded and completed. The way our model works in Ontario, when we go and get project approval, very early stage, there's kind of a vague functional notion, it's a transit line to go from here to here, or it's a hospital north of Toronto about this big. And we get approval. The way our model is set up in Ontario, the long-term infrastructure plan, the way it's done, as long as the project stays under that number, we have approval to keep going. The minute it doesn't, we have to go back and get reapproval. And that's the framework that's been created legislatively. And it squishes some of the strategic misrepresentation, the not the fools but the lying part of your talk, because it actually, it's incredibly, it has a huge spotlight if you were ever to go back after the initial approval to get more money. And Infrastructure Ontario, when we publish our track record, each year we publish for all the projects that are done, how have they done? And we talk about being on time and on budget, and I'm scared to say that because now you're going to say what time and what budget. But we actually publish two things. And if anyone were to go on our website, you'd find we publish what we call A to B and B to C. A to B is from the original project approval moment and the budget that was there until contract award, and B to C is from contract award to completion, so that we're measuring both the upfront planning portion of our process and then the execution, if you will. And when I say we're on time and on budget, I mean both, from A to B and B to C. And as I say, I think part of that is not something certainly I did or we did. It's part of how we're set up legislatively, that we don't have any approvals to go forward if we don't stay under the number. The accusation we get, and we've got it from some people in this room before, is the opposite, that you must create the original budget so high and you sandbag, as we say, so that of course you beat it. And I guess, Matti, relative to the problems you point out, I guess that's a better problem to have. What we do is we always reset our budget at the time of contract award. So if the bids have come in under, that becomes our new budget, and then we measure from there forward. So as I said, the use of P3s, I think we'll get into that in the questions. I have a huge bias in the answer to that question, but I'll just say one thing and then we should go to it. We actually, although we're synonymous with the AFP model, Infrastructure Ontario delivers P3s in Ontario. We are not dogmatic about that as the only solution. I agree with you completely, Matti. You need the right hammer for every nail. And for us, we just think the P3, the balance of financing cost, because there is a premium you pay, and we're obsessed with minimizing that cost. It's not about private ownership or private finance. Our job is to drive that down as low as we can. But we think for the premium that we're currently paying here in Ontario, the benefit of the risk transfer greatly outweighs the cost of the financing on the largest, most complex projects. And there are many where that doesn't make sense, but for those largest and most complex, we think that's the balance we're striking. Thanks.
Thank you. Back to James. When things go wrong, the media is quick to blame project managers, and in turn, project managers tend to blame other factors, whether it be engineering challenges, unexpected archaeological sites, and so forth that Matti mentioned. On average, how much should we attribute the typical cost overrun to these factors versus the so-called psychological factors that Matti has brought up, the so-called over-optimism bias and that sort of thing?
I don't think that's such a simple answer. It's not so obvious. I sort of say again, I think if the project governance at the beginning wasn't set up well, as the project manager takes over the project and starts to deliver, whilst they don't realize it at that point in time, it's already going bad. And things then progressively come out of the woodwork as they deliver. So I think a measure at this point would be very, very difficult and very subjective.
I would just say the one thing you can note is, Matti, the psychological factors, the optimism bias and the strategic trickery. The one thing you can say about them is they're kind of impossible to recover from in many ways, because they're setting the project out on the wrong foot from the get-go. So I don't know how to give a percentage to the two, but as James said, it's so much of it is upfront, both in the way, if a project is significantly underscoped or underrepresented when it's originally approved, there's no great project management that recovers you from that.
James, based on your international experience, and we heard from Matti that there are certain types of projects like transit, based on the academic research, that tend to be over budget, but on the projects that you've worked on around the world, could you explain, what sort of overruns you might have experienced and why these have tended to occur?
I look at very much, it's more to do with the complexity of the projects. So as we see the difference between a brownfield and a greenfield type application of a program, the brownfield programs always have much more complexity and more challenges and are much more likely to be over cost and time. The same can be said to, I'll call it low technology deliverables as opposed to high technology deliverables. And so as the project's complexity, particularly towards integration and interfaces with many stakeholders or many types of technology, the risks become much, much higher for the teams and for everybody to understand at the beginning of the program what those challenges are, and they're generally optimistic, and the projects become over time and subsequent cost.
I'll ask a different question for you, Ehren.
Sure.
In terms of the recommendations that Matti has put forward, if they're implemented, what sorts of repercussions might we expect amongst architects, builders, designers, contractors, lenders, and other players? Are there winners, losers, for example?
Question. Well, as I said, we talked a little bit, just to pick one example, Andy, the idea of the use of past performance. I'll say there's always a trade-off between, I think there's good logic in that one. There's a trade-off, though, in whether that creates a closed market, whether it makes it harder for new entrants, whether they're local or foreign. And whether you create a closed loop, which over time actually has all sets of new problems, and you lose some of the competitiveness of your bidding market. So I think in some of them, I guess, you do have to get about the balance right. I think what's interesting is large projects, because we're talking about large infrastructure projects here. And if you talk about a transit project, it usually has a B in it. These are big projects. And they have myriad contractors delivering them, hundreds typically. But at the top of that food chain, there are only a few large entities that are capable of managing and delivering that kind of complex project. So I do think we're headed towards a world that, where there are some winners and losers, and I don't think that's by virtue of the choices we're making or the solutions Matti outlines. I think it's by nature of where our infrastructure needs are and what it is we're going to be building in the next generation. As we move more heavily into transit projects, it's going to, I think, be a real challenge for some of our smaller domestic firms to have the capabilities, expertise, financial capability to deliver, and they're going to have to play roles within broader teams, I think, to do so. But as I say, I don't think that's a function of choices we're making. I think that's a function of what it is we're trying to get built.
Up on that theme, I think one of the issues here, especially in terms of the benchmarking and performance monitoring, is really around transparency. And I actually think we might find the opposite, which is that the firms that are performing well, that don't engage in monkey business in their bidding, they want this type of transparency because they're being beaten by people who are playing all sorts of strategic games to win the job, bid low, the price goes up. If there's no way of catching this on the next go around, then it happens over and over again. So I actually think what the information and the transparency does is it puts the incentive and it puts the onus on doing the jobs properly and creates an incentive to do that. It also engages the public to be able to be involved in some of that monitoring as well. If the community knows that there's a contractor that's working on their job that has a terrible record of cost overruns, not just because it's been in the media, which I think it could be unfounded, they could have one project that went poorly, but actually because over time the record shows, and it's very public, that they haven't done as well, there is going to be much more scrutiny of that contractor. And so I think the contractors that are good, the ones that are going to be here for the long term, they would want to play in an environment where there's greater transparency and where past performance is encouraged and used to make better decisions in the future.
I'll ask one more question, and I'm sure this theme will come up during the audience, but right after this we'll go to the audience for Q&A. Of the causes of cost overruns, political, psychological, and technical, which is the most difficult to overcome?
Well, I mentioned earlier, I think the challenge is if you start out poorly, it's really hard to overcome. So I guess of them, the psychological, the misbudgeting early on, the misrepresentation, or part of it, the optimism bias, is probably therefore the hardest to overcome in some ways. But I think, answered a different way, those things are also incredibly addressable if you get to the root issues of them, right? So what I'm trying to say is on a given project, those are the hardest to overcome, because once you have them, you're probably not recovering. But at a systemic level, as I said, I gave the example earlier, but in Ontario, the change in our approvals process, such that we don't have the same incentive to strategically misrepresent to get a shovel in the ground and then say, oops, now that I'm into it, I realize it's not a $200 million hospital, it's a $400 million hospital. We have taken that away. And if at a systemic level you do, then those are, you can actually kill them quite easily. Then I would say the really hard ones James talked about earlier are integration and just the complexity of project management in what are massive undertakings that involve many, many different actors, not all with the same incentives.
So I say I agree generally with what you're saying. So not to repeat the same, I think in looking at those types of challenges, one of the examples I think Matti mentioned a little bit, but in the UK, to try to, let's say, reduce the impact of the political side, they've established something called the National Infrastructure Commission, which is completely independent of politics, and all major programs would go to them for vetting for either ranking or approval before the project's then initiated. And the government's or the political interaction is about creating funding for that investment group to allow schemes to go forwards. And so it doesn't fix all the problems, but it does try to reduce that particular issue. In Hong Kong and Singapore, again, they have a different approach. They don't use P3s as an example very much at this point, but they go very, very much towards collaborative contract forms where there is a pain and a gain share process in the projects. They use something called NEC standards for their contracting, and it's really to engage the contractor at the beginning to discuss what the problems and the risks are, really understand those, and create a pain-gain mechanism of some targets to allow the thing to be built, understanding the problems, both sides.
I'm going to stand up so I can see. And then we have a microphone here. So do we have a question? Put up your hand and then the mic will come to you. Your name's not Mike, I guess. But a shy audience. Way at the back there, behind Ian. I can't see who it is, but I see an arm.
This question is for Ehren. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for their presentations and the discussion. It's been really enlightening. Ehren, you mentioned that in Ontario we have a system whereby a contract is evaluated based on initial costs, and then later, if there's an increase to the project, it has to go through approvals over again. And that was a way to kind of mitigate some of the complexities that Matti pointed out. I'm just wondering if there is statistics on how often that does mitigate that issue, because if there's substantial investment already made in a project, and let's say there's a 10, 20, 30% increase on that project, wouldn't there be maybe some tendency to agree to that increase?
Got it. So just to clarify, so what happens in our system is a project is identified as a need, whether it's in my world, whether it's a hospital or a road or a transit project or a college building, and a very preliminary amount of work is done. Functional programming is what we call it, figuring out how many people it's meant to serve or what type of project it is. And based on that very early work, an initial budget is developed. And that's the first number that I'm talking about. And that goes forward and gets government approval, the project, the need for the project, and a budget envelope, if I can call it that way. That's the number that's getting approved at that point. That allows the project, so that's that first number that I was talking about. That allows the project to move into more detailed planning. And if it's a large enough project that's headed down a P3 model, to move into the market and start to go out for qualification of bidders and eventually for an RFP process. And what happens then is you define the project a lot better. You get a better sense of what it is you're going to build. You put that out to the market. It's still a conceptual design at that point, but you've done a lot more work around what it is exactly, what patient base the hospital's serving and how many floors it will have and how many operating rooms it will have. And you eventually run a bidding process and get bids. And now you have a contracted award amount for the project, to use Matti's lingo. My point is, if that number is higher than what the original approval is, you have to go back and get approval, okay? The answer to your question is, in the 45 or so projects that we've seen all the way through to completion today over the last decade, that number being higher than the first one has happened on one of them, where we've had to go back. Well, no, actually, let me reframe that a little bit. Two things could happen at that moment, okay? One, you could actually rescope the project and say, oh, I was given a budget of $500 million. Now that I've finished fleshing it out, I've gone out to the market, they've told me it's going to cost $600 million. I can take a floor out, I can take operating rooms that I can get back underneath my $500 million. And that's actually what typically happens. Us working with the sponsor or owner of the asset, a hospital, a college, a transit agency, would say, we only were given $500 million. Going back and asking for that extra $100 million will be incredibly painful. Let's really think about ways to cut scope. That has happened before, and I actually think that's a very useful mechanism, and it forces the public sector to not gold plate and not over-design. It actually bumps into the future-proofing point that Andy made earlier, and there's an interesting contrast, because one of the critiques you get is that forces you into getting like the functional need you have met and maybe not doing that forward look. I think that's a very interesting place to explore. But the most common thing that would happen is that you'd rescope and make sure you fit within your approval. It is very rare, as I say only once, that we would go back and say, we don't fit within the approval we had and we need more money. So as I said, that's the rarity, it's really the exception. Our whole system's geared towards staying underneath that initial number.
I pick up on something here, because the way Ehren describes that, it sounds so rational and it sounds so logical. And I think what I want to get at is, I think for most of the projects that we never hear about and never make the pages of the newspaper, it probably does look something like that. So I would say there are a lot of projects that are happening that we never hear about, that are very orderly and go much like that. That's a very rational process. The problem is for the ones that we read about in the newspaper, the ones that there's very little evaluation and it's completely disorganized, and people are shouting out different numbers and different proposals every day, and it doesn't sound like or look anything like what Ehren has described. And I think those are the ones that the public is losing trust and becoming very cynical about. And I think it's those types of occurrences, and we could list any number of projects that's happening to Scarborough Subway. And so I think what we really need to try to get to a point where not just select projects are the ones that aren't high profile, but all of the projects are going through something that's as logical and as thoughtful as what Ehren's talking about, so that we don't proceed with projects that either should have never been funded in the first place, or where very little preliminary evaluation is made before all sorts of political commitments at all levels of government. I mean, Rob Ford got the Scarborough Subway funded with no cost estimate, no ridership study. So which direction do you think costs are going to go on that until we get to this point? I mean, it's really, it's completely different than what Ehren's describing. I think we need to make sure that all of our projects are done in that logical and rational way.
Agreed, Matti, and I think you didn't say it, but I think transit is the place where this is most acutely felt, not just here, but probably around the world, because those are uniquely in the public sphere. They have all the criteria. They're in the public sphere. They're incredibly long lead time. They change a lot from start to finish. Governments or decision makers often change before the project has very matured, so they go through a lot of iterations, and they have a lot of public scrutiny and interest, and I think they're the ones that get into that problem the most.
Anyone else? Michael.
Hi, Michael Fenn. I'd like to take that last point a little further. I think when you do the original scope on infrastructure projects, there's usually a lot of public input and a lot of stakeholder involvement and a lot of visioning of what's going to be done and so on. And then when you get, when the bill comes in, the estimate comes in, you get into a value engineering exercise. My observation is the value engineering process is a much more circumscribed group of people making that decision, and many of them are doing it with the kind of criteria that Ehren's talking about, making it fit in an envelope and so on. I guess one of the things that I think is a bit of an issue that Matti has touched on is when you make that decision, you have often value engineering decisions that, you could build district heating on this thing, but let's not, because it'll be expensive. Or we could make an architectural statement on the subway stations, or we could make them utilitarian and cut a lot of money out. That kind of debate rarely is part of the rescoping exercise. Well, it is part of the rescoping exercise, but the group of people making the decision are often have a a bias to doing something that's really very financial in its flavor.
Comment?
It's your.
No, you go ahead. I think I tend to agree with that. I think the value engineering can in many cases change the projects to fit them within the budget. And we don't often go back to our stakeholders, at least broadly in the community, and reflect on what those changes, the implications of those changes are. Sometimes the scope actually continues to increase as things get added in later on, like new stations on a subway. And then those are being traded off against all sorts of different considerations. But it's clear that the finances are driving a lot of this, and that's part of the political dimension of it. So yeah, I think that's an astute observation.
I think Mark Romoff actually threatened to ask a ruthless question, so maybe you're low on your B12 now, but do you have anything to add?
It's less about questions, and I guess it's more about a comment on the work that's being done. First of all, the fact that we can even have a discussion on this subject that's rational and pragmatic is hugely beneficial, right? And part of the challenge, whether we're talking about traditional procurement or using an AFP or a P3 model, is that it quickly just gets into a ludicrous discussion, right? Because it excites people and it brings out the ideologues and all that. We've got to get past all of that, right? And so these are very general comments. My own view is that you can, for whatever reason, public-private partnerships tend to get an enormous amount of scrutiny, which traditionally procured projects manage to avoid. And our own view has always been that if you could bring the same kind of scrutiny, the same kind of demands to traditional procurement, they would be much better done too, right? So it's less about which of the approaches is better. It's more about how you actually really do go about your business. And the other, sorry, I'll ramble a bit without a doubt, because these are just sort of comments. But the other thing that we've found when we've surveyed people around the country is that, one, no matter what you're doing, people don't trust government. It's given, right? So they're suspicious of government, and governments do have a track record of not being the best at managing our tax dollars. But the second thing, which is really important, is that the view we've heard over and over again is that irrespective of these projects, whether they're good or bad, there isn't enough communication with taxpayers. So they sort of feel a little bit divorced from all of it. And because in the end, they don't care. They just want a brand new hospital or a great school for their kids or whatever, right? But somehow the engagement with the community is an area that could always use a bit more work. You know, we always say this, you communicate, and by the way, communicate a bit more, right? And I guess the final comment I would make is that there is definitely a concern around the lack of understanding on the part of decision makers of procurement generally. And so, and this is just the reality, and I think we see a bit more of that now at maybe the municipal level or with First Nations communities who have huge infrastructure challenges that they're confronting, but their own skill set or capacity is a work in progress. So it's critically important, again, irrespective of the kind of dialogue we're having here, it's critically important to get decision makers much more knowledgeable about what they have to decide on, and because they're part of the accountability process. So all that to say, I don't really have a question. I just think these are things that keep coming up, and if we can address those, I think there would be a far better appreciation of the subject by everyone. And because my sense is that irrespective of the debate, we're really not very far apart. And when logic applies, everybody can quickly agree, which is why, you know, some people may hate Matti, but the reality is when you give him a podium like this, he's unbelievably pragmatic. You can't walk away not liking him. So it's the nature of it, right? And it's really important to have that dialogue. So I'll stop there.
Matti, do you want to comment? And then the very last question for me and Dobson back there.
I think my key points, thanks Mark. I think my key
So
point is
ruthless.
really, I think the key thing is that all of the projects should be properly managed, and a lot of resources have gone into managing P3 projects well, and we're getting good results in large measure because the people who work on these projects are highly trained and highly skilled. And I think that it seems odd that if the project goes the P3 route, you get the best experts working on those projects. And if it goes the traditional route, maybe you get someone who hasn't worked on those projects quite as frequently or hasn't done a job at that scale before. And so we really need to, the training capacity, I think, is critical. I think the federal government, as part of this funding round, could play a role in training up people within their own government and at different levels of government. That could be an important role. The UK government took the lead on that in their context at the national level. So that's something I think that could play a big role. The other point I just do want to raise is, if we're trying to avoid ideology on this, it is important to say the cost overruns, and repeat this, cost overruns are a public and a private sector problem. If you're a Bombardier shareholder today, you are very aware of cost overruns because they had a huge overrun on the C-Jet, and that has now tanked the shares. And in fact, if you live in Canada, we might become investors in that because they're now asking the federal government for money. So this is not just, this is a government problem. We see it right across the country, but it's something that's much more endemic to big projects. And in fact, I think private sector firms could learn as much from this research and these ideas about how to manage their own costs as governments could as well.
Yes, thank you, Ian Dobson. Matti, I read your paper before I got here, and I thought it was extremely well done. Congratulations. We tend to focus a lot about the negatives of construction and cost overruns and so forth. And I wondered if the panels might comment a little bit. I will also congratulate Infrastructure Ontario because they don't talk enough about the good projects that they do on time and on budget. And of course, that doesn't end up in the front page. But one of the most complex transit projects underway in the world today started out as this Crossrail in London. It's very complex. It goes underneath London subway, and it's runs in operating surface rail lines, Great Eastern, Great Western. The original cost budget under the Labour government was £18 billion. When the Tory government came into power, as they were discussing the whole thing, it dropped to about £16.2 billion. It's going to be delivered on time. From the date the bill dropped in 2008 till the delivery will be just under 10 years. And the project's going to cost £14.9 billion. What lessons can we learn from that project as we go forward in this region?
Look at me being English, but hasten to add, I've been living in Asia for 20 years. So I have a very little involvement in Crossrail. The only comment I would make is that in terms of what I'm calling the project governance, it was set up very robustly at the beginning of the project. All stakeholders were engaged. So there were, I call it, existing operators, existing asset owners. They have invited, I'll call it, the world's best to come and give advice and contribution before the work was started. And so there was, a long period of investigation, discussion, interaction with the various contractors as to what could or couldn't be done. And then as the project became mature in terms of things like the operation, which rolling stock they're going to buy, there was a collaborative way of going through that dialogue, and they've now, as opposed to the rest of the operations in London, they've outsourced that operation to Hong Kong MTR, demonstrated that they could complete the end of the project, buy the rolling stock, and operate the system in far in excess of what the original owner thought they could do. And so in terms of the transformation of the owner, it's a very brave owner that says somebody can do it better than yourself.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add, I agree with you completely, James, and we've had the chance, Infrastructure Ontario and Metrolinx both have had the chance to both go over and visit with the Crossrail folks, and we've had them here a couple of times, so we're trying to learn from them. I think the thing you said is the thing that has stuck with me as well. You talked about governance change, but the other thing is they did what, when we have projects go well, one of the things we know is you often have to go slow to go fast. Your due diligence, it's all of the work you do up front that allows you to ultimately be faster finished. Shovel in ground is one of the worst incentives you can have, and I shovel-ready projects always make me nervous. On Crossrail, I think they did a really good job of taking their time, of thinking through governance issues, project management issues, contract structuring issues. It's not even one size fits all from a contracting perspective, and I think that's been smart in their case. And as James said, they also have made pretty fundamental change to their approach on the operating side as they've gone. They've learned as they went. So I think in big projects that upfront due diligence and time spent structuring usually pays dividends down the road, and they've done that well, it seems.
I think that's a wrap. By the way, we heard a phrase today at noon hour. Minister Sohi talked about shovel-worthy.
Ah, very good.
Well, the job comes to me now to thank everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Matti, both for doing the paper and making the presentation today. This is the second time this week I heard Matti speak, and he's always just a little controversial, which makes his presentations very interesting, but always backed with evidence and always clearly articulated. As Mark Romoff says, you can't help but like him. So thank you, Matti. I'd also like to thank our discussants, Ehren and James, for bringing a non-academic perspective to the discussion, although unlike some of the sessions we have, the academic and the non-academic were pretty close today. But thank you for your perspectives here and internationally. And finally, thanks to Andy for moderating the session, keeping us on time and keeping everyone in line, and also providing some of your own thoughts. So please join me in thanking our presenters. I'll just remind you that the session today was webcast, so if you missed something and you didn't hear something or you want someone else to see it, it'll be on our website shortly. And also you can download Matti's paper from our website. Thank you.